In this lesson, we're going to use our rotoed alpha channel to fix some ambient occlusion and shadowing issues we're getting. So here's where we left off, and you can open up 10_begin. Now if we take a look at before the shadows and ambient occlusion are introduced and afterwards, we can see some errors that begin occurring. And let's actually look at the final merge. So here at the end, we can see these two strange lines appearing from our ambient occlusion and our shadowing. Now, these really only appear at the end of our sequence. So we need to come in and fix these two issues because they are pretty readily apparent. We also have a little bit of an ambient occlusion overlapping right here, as well as up here on top and up here on the bottom as well. So let's use our new alpha channel to blur this edge here out and clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to control left click and drag my copy node up to give us a little bit more space to work with. And I'll just move the tracker node to stay with that information. And now let's shuffle our alpha into a new channel so we can begin editing it without affecting our alpha channel. So again, we have this alpha roto shape that we created. So let's come in and let's shuffle this. So I'm going to hit tab, type in shuffle. And let's shuffle this into our mask port. So under other layers, drop down and there's a mask port that has a simple alpha channel inside. So let's move our alpha into that mask alpha. So now let's take a look at the mask alpha. And if we hit the R key, we can see this alpha channel. Alright, so let's begin by making this a little bit larger. So let's drop in one of the erodes. So I'm going to hit tab, go to erode. Let's try an erode blur. And let's see, we want to erode blur our mask channel. And we want to make this a little bit larger. So let's blur this out a little bit. And let's take a look at our erode here. So let's see, we start at about size 0. And if we hit minus, we're blurring this out just ever so slightly. Now, instead of that erode, we could also use the erode fast, which gives us a dilate node, which again we need to set to our mask, and this also lets us dilate that out. So depending on your preferences, you can use either the erode or the dilate. In this case, I kind of like the dilate a little bit better, so let's use that. Alright, so we've pushed out our alpha a little bit. So now let's plug this into a blur to see what this looks like. So let's plug our mask port or our mask.a into the mask, and let's give this a bit of a blur. Now this is going to blur our color channels, which is what we do not want. We want it to blur our ambient occlusion and our shadow. So let's go to channels and let's change that to our AO shadow. And so what we're doing now is we're just giving our ambient occlusion and our shadow channel a little bit of a blur. Let's see if that comes in and fixes that. We might need to increase the size of that blur. And we also might need to actually view the final result to see what this looks like. So here it is at 0 blur. And you can see as we begin increasing this, we begin softening out those edges so they become less apparent. Now, of course, if we really wanted to, we could go in and mask this out to really gain a lot of control over this effect. But I found that a little blur on this isn't really going to hurt anything. Now, we don't want to go too far because then we could begin extending this out a little bit too high. So we just want to give this enough of a blur that these edges or these lines disappear or appear less prominent. So let's say at about a blur of 9 looks pretty good. So let's set a key and let's go back to where this blur is not needed. So let's see, probably around frame, I'd say 124, we don't really need this. So let's set that to 0 so we can keep our blur sharp at that point. And then when we begin to need it, we can again set this back at around 6. So let's just check that animation just to make sure that that edge doesn't appear. And we are going to get these blurred a little bit with a depth of field blur and a motion blur. But we always want to be careful and check our scene for these edges before we begin relying on an external solution such as the motion blur or depth of field blur. Okay, that's looking pretty good. All right, great. So just by creatively using an alpha channel that we already had lying around, we were able to come in and fix a shadowing and ambient occlusion problem from our 3D renders quickly and easily. Now again, this isn't a perfect solution because we are losing a little bit of detail. However, since the rotoscoping on this would take quite a while, we can just be happy with this effect. Now, I am noticing a tiny little edge here on the bottom, so if you see that, you can of course increase your dilate, and that will increase the size of that blur, or you can decrease the size of the dilate, and that will pull that effect back a little bit. Just going to increase this dilate just a little bit further. Okay, great. So now let's begin by adding in the various blurs we have access to, such as the motion blur, as well as the Z blur, to blur our various passes.